The rain came sideways, hard as thrown gravel, and the church bell was ringing when nobody was inside to pull its rope. Wind shoved wet dust across Main Street, turned the lamps to ghosts. I was at the schoolhouse window with Bo's long rifle braced on the sill, cheek against splintered wood, breath fogging the pane. The glass rattled like teeth. Out past the pump, under the saloon's sagging porch, Bo leaned a shoulder to a post and held one hand to his side, as if he were keeping a promise from spilling out. He raised his eyes once, calm as a man looking at weather he already knew. Hoofbeats rolled in from the canyon staggered, then together the way thunder learns its own name. Shadows slid at the edges of buildings. A hat brim moved where no man should have been, and a muzzle flashed pale against the rain, just a lick of fire, quick and mean. The wind ferried the smell of powder and wet creosote. It carried other things too, the sour scent of a man's fear, the clean cut of a woman's resolve. I could see Harlan Reeves' men by how careful they were. Hired iron steps, different. Heel heavy, toe light. They knifed across the dark, 3 of them, maybe 4, using wagons for shelter. One wore a slicker too new for this territory, oil shining like a fish back. Another had a limp I remembered from the day a stranger stood in my doorway and asked soft if I planned to teach children hope they couldn't afford. The limp fit the voice. The voice fit the letter. That letter sits under the stove now, burnt to a curl. But a piece of blue ribbon didn't catch, and I can still see the anchor stamped in wax. It said Boston. It smelled of bay rum and train smoke. It used my father's hard G where he never would. "Come home," it began, and the paper shook in my hands though there was no wind indoors. I laid it down and felt the town looking at me through its windows, waiting to see what a barren woman weighed against rain and rumor. Lightning walked across the face of the mesa. The bell went again one long, angry note, and coyotes answered it from the rim. Somewhere behind me, the children's slates lay stacked, still wet from when I wiped them clean at dusk. On the top one, a small hand had left a curve of chalk like a moon. I thought of that curve, and of the burned edge of ribbon, and of Bo saying nothing at my kitchen table while the coffee went cold and the stove ticked as though counting us down. He's a man who keeps his talk and pays his debts. He had buried a wife and a child out on the north pasture where the grass remembers better than the headstones. He thought grief meant he didn't owe the living. He was wrong. The land won't allow it. Even the rain tries to pay something back. A muzzle flared again from the alley by Dell's place. Wood spat from the schoolhouse doorframe and bit my cheek. I didn't move. I breathed through the metal taste, let the rifle settle like a sleeping animal. The lamplight caught on a figure at the edge of the street coat, collar up, hat pinned quiet, watching as if he were measuring me and the world both. The rain bent around him. I knew that stance, though I couldn't place the day I learned it. "Reeves!" someone yelled far and near, like his name had 2 throats. Bo's body lifted from the post, a finger's worth. His mouth made a shape that could have been my name, or a prayer. He held my eyes and gave a little shake of his head. Not no, not yes, a thing like trust. The hardest thing a person can hand over. The wind leaned into me. The gunstock smelled of oil in old days. I took the sight onto a dark shoulder, moving against the saloon wall. Then a different dark, where a hand reached for fire. Silence pooled between bell strokes. All the talk this town ever made lay thin as water on the boards. I set my cheek to the worn wood and sent their silence down the barrel. The coach driver spat into the dust before he swung open the door. "Dust Creek," he said flat, like the words themselves tasted bitter. No cheer in it, no welcome. The air outside was heavy with grit, a copper tang of heat that rode the lungs like sandpaper. Ella stepped down, her boots sinking into red earth that hadn't seen rain in months. The wind carried the smell of horse sweat, gun oil, and the faint sourness of spilled whiskey from the saloon up the street. The town looked like it had been built in a hurry and was already tired of standing. Boards warped, signs half-hanging, paint bled pale by sun. A dog skulked between the trough and the livery, ribs showing, ears pricked at every passing boot. No one greeted her. A boy ran by and glanced up once sharp, curious, suspicious, and then was gone into the alley's shade. Ella drew her shawl tighter, though the air was oven hot. She'd been told to come west to start over. But the West didn't make room for that. It measured folk by how they endured, not by what they hoped for. She touched the satchel at her side, where the last letter from Boston lay folded ink, scrawled in a hand too perfect to be true. She hadn't decided yet whether to believe its call to return or the quiet ache that pushed her forward. The letter's wax seal had carried a ship's anchor, something her father never would have used. She remembered that much. The stage pulled away in a clatter, leaving her in a small storm of red dust. When it settled, she saw him for the first time. Bo Callahan stood across the street, hat low, coat shoulders broad as a corral gate. He was unloading sacks of feed from a wagon with his sister beside him. Sarah's braid swung like a rope, strong and sure, her movements quick while his were slow, measured like every gesture weighed against memory. Ella watched him pause, hand pressed for a moment on the rim of the sack, eyes lost in some far-off place. Then he looked up, only once, and their gazes crossed the road. His eyes were not curious, not cold, just old, older than his face, carrying the kind of silence only graves can give. He dropped his look before she could find words. Sarah caught the glance, though. She gave a half smile, the kind that welcomes without promise. Then she went back to work, slapping the dust from her palms. Ella breathed, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the schoolhouse at the edge of town. The bell rope hung limp there, frayed, its clapper silent. Inside the room, the benches were rough-hewn chalk shards scattered on the floor like teeth. She set her satchel down on the teacher's desk, ran a hand across the wood, and felt the groove where some boy had carved initials. The silence pressed close, and for the first time she wondered if she was meant to fill it or drown in it. Behind her, a boot scuffed at the doorway. She turned and saw the sheriff Amos Pike, hat in hand, mouth tight. He greeted her by name but with no warmth, as if she were another claim staked and bound to fail. His eyes lingered on her ringless hand, then flicked away. "School starts Monday," he said. "Children will come if their folks allow." He left before she could answer. His shadow seemed to stay longer than he did. When night came, Ella lit a lamp and sat by the window. The wind rattled the pane, carrying distant coyotes and the restless shuffle of hoofbeats on hard ground. She thought of Bo's eyes across the street, of Sarah's smile, of the sheriff's warning, and when she reached into her satchel and felt that false letter again, the wax already crumbling in her fingers, she wondered if Dust Creek had been waiting for her or if it meant to swallow her whole. The first thing Ella noticed was the sky turning yellow, like old parchment singed at the edges. Chickens scurried under the schoolhouse porch, and a horse screamed from the livery. Dust storms came fast out here, faster than the mind could ready itself. The children stiffened on their benches when the light dimmed, their slates suddenly pale in the gloom. She told them to gather close, voice steadier than her hands. The wind hit with a sound like canvas tearing. Boards groaned. Fine grit poured through every crack, stung her eyes, filled her teeth. She pulled the smallest children beneath the desks and covered their heads with shawls. The older ones pressed the shutters tight, but dust seeped through anyway, whispering along the floorboards. In the storm's roar, she caught herself thinking of Boston's quiet libraries, the polished wood of her father's study, the smell of rain on cobblestone. Then the memory broke, carried off by the rattle of loose nails. She looked at the chalkboard through the storm haze. The word hope was half written there from the morning lesson, white line cutting through the brown gloom. Her throat caught. Out here, even hope was sandblasted thin. Across town, Bo and Sarah were on the open range, driving a herd into makeshift shelter. Dust rolled over them like waves. Sarah shouted through her bandana, voice ripped ragged, while Bo's eyes stung red as he swung the rope to steady a panicked steer. Each blow of grit was another reminder of what the land took without asking. He thought of Rebecca, of the night the raiders came, how smoke and dust then had choked him just the same. He tasted ash, though none burned now. He pushed the thought down, forcing his body to labor where his mind stumbled. Back in the schoolhouse, the children huddled silent except for one boy crying soft against his sleeve. Ella pressed his hand into hers, rough comfort in the storm's howl. She whispered that walls hold, that storms pass, though she wasn't sure she believed it. A shutter cracked open with a slap, and grit swept across the room like thrown gravel. She lunged, dragging the window closed with both arms, heart hammering. When the gale finally softened, the world settled into silence thick as ash. The children stirred, brushing dust from their hair, faces pale with it. Ella rose slowly, skirts heavy, and walked to the board. She traced the chalkboard with her finger until it blurred into nothing, then turned back to the children with grit still on her lips. Outside, the street looked scoured, signs torn, troughs emptied. Men staggered out of the saloon, coughing, cursing the wind, and in their wake came whispers sharp as needles, passed from mouth to mouth. Ella heard them as she walked the children home. Boston woman, empty-handed, can't give the land no future. The words rode the same dust the storm left behind, and she felt them settle on her like another layer of grit she could not wash off. At the ranch that night, Bo stood on the porch wiping his eyes with a sleeve, Sarah beside him with dirt in her braid. They had made it through with the herd mostly intact. But Bo stared past the corral to where the mesa loomed black in the starlight. He thought of the storm, the raid, and how death had always come for him through wind and fire. And now, watching the glow of the schoolhouse lamp across town, he felt the storm had only just begun. The coyotes sang low that night, not from hunger but from knowing. their voices threading the dark like an old grief come calling again. The wire was new, still shining where the sun caught it. Ella saw it first when she walked the children home across the pasture, the line of barbed steel cutting the horizon, stretching where open ground used to breathe. The cattle pressed uneasy against it, lowing like they knew freedom had been halved overnight. She paused, hands shading her eyes, and felt the quiet menace in that fence more than in any pistol she'd yet faced. Bo came riding slow along the wire, reins slack, face unreadable beneath his hat. He tipped it once at her, then swung down stiff from the saddle. Sarah followed on foot, eyes sharp with anger. Reeves's men laid it in the dark, she muttered. Didn't ask, didn't warn. Just carved the land like it was theirs. Bo said nothing, just touched the barbs with his glove, as if weighing what it meant. His silence wasn't peace, it was the kind that comes before thunder. Ella felt it between them, heavy as the storm that had scoured the town days before. That evening at the ranch, she brought them a book of verse she'd carried west, worn from the journey. She read by lamplight while Sarah mended a harness and Bo sharpened a blade. The words were plain, but the cadence softened the edges of the day. When she closed it, she found Bo had set aside the whetstone. He offered her a small leather pouch, rough-stitched, smelling of smoke and horse. Inside lay a polished stone, river-worn, no bigger than her palm. Found it after the storm, he said, voice low. Figured it survived more than most. She closed her fingers over it, felt the cool weight. She didn't thank him. In that room, words felt weaker than silence. The knock came late. Sheriff Pike at the door, dust still on his boots, jaw clenched. He glanced from Ella to Bo, then to Sarah, before setting his hat against his chest. Reeves has been buying notes, he said. Mortgages, debts, small plots. He's close to owning half the valley. Your well's next in his sights. Bo leaned against the table, arms crossed, face a shadow in the lamplight. Law going to stop him? Pike didn't answer quick. He looked down, thumb tracing the brim of his hat. Finally, law's what he pays for. What you got is what you can hold. He left without more, and the sound of his boots fading was lonelier than a coyote's cry. After he was gone, Sarah spat into the fire, cursing Reeves's name under her breath. Ella stared at the stone in her hand, turning it over and over, thinking of the letter with its false seal, the one that tried to pull her away before she'd even set down roots. She wondered if Reeves's reach went that far, if the lies that hunted her in Boston had carried west under his mark. Bo finally spoke, voice gravel rough. He's not after cattle, he's after water, and he'll bleed whoever stands in the way. The wind pressed against the windows, steady and low, as if the land itself was listening. Ella set the stone down on the table, but its weight lingered in her hand long after. The first sign came with smoke curled under the schoolhouse door. Ella had been sweeping, chalk dust still clinging to her sleeves, when the acrid sting cut her nose. She dropped the broom and pulled the latch wide. A black smear ran up the wood, oily and mean, where someone had poured lamp fuel and struck a match. The fire hadn't caught, wind must have snuffed it, but the mark burned deeper than flame. She stood there, watching the smoke drift away, heart thudding, slow and heavy. The children's slates lay stacked by the desk, clean from the last lesson, their edges now tainted with soot. She pressed her hand against the charred frame. Whoever had done this hadn't meant to scare, they'd meant to erase. By evening, word had spread. Some folks shook their heads, muttering it was boys' mischief. Others looked away too quick, as if silence kept them safe. In the saloon, Reeves's men laughed louder than usual, their voices carrying through the swinging doors like spurs dragged on stone. No one asked after Ella, no one offered watch. Bo did. He came up the ridge that night, rifle slung, horse tied quiet. She found him leaning against the schoolhouse wall when she stepped out with a lantern. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but she could tell he'd been there a while. He didn't speak at first, just shifted his weight, scanning the dark edges of town where coyotes padded unseen. When he did speak, it was plain. Storms take what they want, men too. Best know which kind you're facing. She thought of Boston's letter then, the one sealed wrong, words that never belonged to her father's hand. The mystery pressed close again, harder now. Reeves's reach, his barbed wire, the sheriff's warning it all fit too neat. She wanted to tell Bo, but the words stayed lodged, heavy as stone in her throat. Instead, she asked, "Do you think they'll come back?" Bo's jaw worked slow. "If they believe you'll run." That night, Ella kept her lantern lit long, though it only deepened the shadows. She sat at her desk with the burnt wood at her back, chalk in hand, and wrote strength across the blackboard until the word blurred in her tired eyes. Bo rode the fence line come dawn, Sarah with him, driving the herd from where the wire cut the land. The cattle balked at the glint of steel, lowing in protest. Dust rose like a ghost behind them, choking out the sky. Sarah spat and cursed Reeves's name again, but Bo only worked in silence, eyes narrowed, shoulders hard. He was remembering another fire the raid years back. The child's scream swallowed by smoke. He'd buried grief deep, but smoke has a way of finding what's hidden. When he returned to the ranch porch, he found Ella waiting, the river stone he'd given her in her hand. She placed it on the rail, slow, like setting down a truth. Her eyes met his, clear but rimmed with sleeplessness. "If they mean to break me," she said, "they'll have to finish the job." The wind shifted then, carrying with it the faint smell of oil and char, as if the night still smoldered somewhere unseen. And Bo knew what Ella hadn't said. The storm hadn't passed, it was only gathering. The letter came folded neat, ink black and steady, the seal pressed with that same anchor she had seen once before. It was slipped under the schoolhouse door at dawn, no footprints in the dust to name its bearer. Ella sat at her desk with the lamp still burning low, staring at the script that claimed her father's hand but carried none of his weight. The words told her Boston waited, that her place was not here, that she was a woman without children and should not waste herself among strangers. Her breath grew shallow as she read. She knew the shape of her father's letters, the tilt of his G, the firm downward stroke on every T. This hand was too clean, too careful. Her fingers trembled, but not with surprise, with recognition. Reeves's reach smelled of money and smoke, and now it smelled of ink as well. Bo found her that afternoon, standing on the porch with the false letter clutched tight. His eyes went to it, then to her face. She wanted to hide it, but instead she held it out. He read slow, jaw tightening with each line. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, curse already on her lips before he finished. "That ain't your father's hand," Sarah said, spitting into the dust. "I've seen Boston ink. This one reeks of Reeves." Bo folded the paper once, twice, then again, until it was a square as small as a bullet. He slipped it into his pocket without a word. Ella's chest ached at the silence between them, heavier than any insult the town had thrown her way. She drew breath and let it out as truth. "He's right about one thing," she whispered. "I cannot bear children. Reeves twisted to shame me, but it's true." The air seemed to harden. A horse stamped in the corral. Sarah's eyes softened first, but it was Bo who moved, slow as dusk. He took her hand, rough fingers closing over hers, steady as stone. "Children or not," he said, voice low, "you've carried more than most men could stand. That's enough." His words cut through her shame like a blade through rope. But shame leaves marks even after it's severed. She thought of the schoolhouse, of the word strength still faint on the chalkboard, of the charred wood at its doorframe. Reeves had tried to erase her once with fire, now with lies. Both times, she had remained. That night, Bo built a small fire by the barn. Ella brought the letter. He handed her the match. The flame caught quick, paper curling, anchor seal blackening to ash. They watched until nothing remained but embers, sparks drifting upward into a sky where coyotes sang. For the first time since she stepped off the stage in Dust Creek, Ella felt she was not standing alone. Still, as the fire died, she glanced toward the dark horizon where Reeves's land stretched. She knew men like him never stopped with one weapon. And the night wind carried the truth in its long, hollow whistle that the worst was not yet behind them. The cattle stirred before the storm broke. Low, restless sounds, hooves drumming against dry earth as if they felt the danger first. Ella stood at the schoolhouse window, lantern dimmed, watching the horizon where lightning stitched crooked seams into the clouds. The smell of rain came sharp through the cracks, mixed with the sour musk of men she knew they were out there, waiting. Sarah burst through the door, hair plastered with sweat, eyes hard. "They've cut the herd." Reeves sent his jackals. Her voice was flat, but her hands trembled as she grabbed for cartridges. Behind her, Bo staggered in, rifle in hand, jaw clenched against a pain already darkening his side. He'd taken a graze in the first volley, dust still clinging to the blood. He set his back to the wall and said nothing. But the silence between his breaths spoke plenty. The outlaws rode through rain that came in sheets, their shadows flashing white each time the sky split. Ella saw one lean down, torch in hand, riding toward the barn. Without thought, she seized Bo's rifle, braced it against the sill the way he'd once shown her. Her heart beat heavy, but her sight held steady. She pulled the trigger. The crack split the storm, the man toppled, torch sputtering into mud. For a moment, the herd stilled, as if the land itself had drawn a breath. Gunfire answered, sharp and merciless. Windows shattered, boards screamed, and the air filled with the iron tang of powder. Sarah fired from the doorway, her shouts lost to thunder. Bo forced himself upright, blood slick on his shirt, and stepped into the street, rifle steady, though his knees betrayed him. He advanced slow, each step a promise, until Reeves showed himself in the saloon's doorway, hat dry beneath the eaves, smile cut thin as wire. "Land was never yours, Callahan," Reeves called, voice carrying over the storm. "You just held it till a stronger hand came along." Bo said nothing. He leveled his gun, eyes like stone. The two men stood framed in the lamplight, and the storm, everything else falling away, the cattle, the gunfire, even Ella's breath. It was the same image she had seen in that first vision weeks ago. Bo against the post, Reeves's shadow in the rain, the town holding its silence like a rope about to break. The duel was over in 3 heartbeats. Reeves fired first, shot wild in the thunder's roar. Bo's answer was slower, certain. The bullet took Reeves in the chest, driving him back into lamplight, his hand clawing at the doorway before he dropped into the mud. The outlaws faltered, their fight bleeding out with his fall. Some fled into the canyons, others tossed guns into the dirt as the townsfolk, roused at last, poured from doorways with their own rifles. But Ella saw none of it clear. Her eyes were on Bo, his rifle slipping from his hands, his body leaning hard against the post as rain and blood mixed at his boots. She ran to him, hands pressing against the wound, lantern light trembling on his face. He looked at her once, steady despite the pain, and managed the faintest shake of his head, the same motion she remembered from that night she'd first seen him across the storm. And in that small gesture, she felt the weight of the land, the silence of graves, and the promise that the West never gave without taking something in return. The storm passed, but the ground held its memory. Mud clung heavy to boots, and the air reeked of spent powder and wet leather. The saloon lanterns burned low, their glow spilling weakly onto streets streaked with blood and rainwater. No voices carried, even the coyotes kept to silence. Ella worked with her hands steady, though her heart had not slowed since the last shot fell. She pressed cloth against Bo's wound, needle-biting flesh, thread darkening quick as it passed through. His eyes were closed, face pale, breath shallow yet stubborn. She did not speak. Words would have been wasted on pain. He already knew too well. When the stitches were tied, she washed the blood from her fingers in a basin blackened with soot. The water ran crimson, rippling with each tremor of her hand. Outside, Sarah paced the porch, the boards creaking under her boots. Rifle still in reach, though the night was quiet. The silence itself was a weight too complete, too listening. The schoolhouse bore its scars. Shutters shattered, doorframe blackened again, this time not by lamp oil, but by bullets. Ella walked its length alone, lantern in hand, light flickering over chalk shards scattered across the floor. On the board, faint beneath the storm's smear, lingered the word she had once written. Strength. She touched it, chalk turning to dust under her fingers. Her thoughts drifted to the false letter, its ink burned away, yet its lie still alive in whispers. She wondered if Reeves had been the only hand behind it, or if others in Boston still sought to see her undone. The anchor seal haunted her even now, pressed deeper in memory than in wax. At dawn, she took a hammer and new boards to the schoolhouse door, nails ringing sharp in the cool morning air. With each strike, she felt something inside settle, not healed, not whole, but fastened for the moment, like a loose shutter forced tight against the wind. Bo rose from his bed before the wound was ready, limping the fence line, hand on the posts as though holding the land upright. He did not ask her to follow, but she did, silent steps beside him. The cattle were restless still, heads lifting at every coyote call, their hides marked by the storm's mud and Reeves's theft. They stopped at the ridge. The valley below lay quiet, scrub glistening in the weak light, no riders on the horizon. Bo's breath rasped slow. Ella stood close, hands clasped against the morning chill, and thought how thin the line was between keeping and losing land, life, or love. When they turned back, Sarah poured coffee strong enough to burn the tongue, set the cups on the stoop, and said nothing. The three of them drank in silence while the wind shifted, carrying a scent that was not of rain nor of gunfire, but of smoke long past. It was the smell of graves reopened by memory, and it told them the West was not finished testing what they were willing to hold. The town gathered in silence when Reeves's body was hauled from the mud. No preacher spoke, no bell tolled, just the scrape of boots on wet boards and the quick glance of men who'd once nodded to him in the street. By sundown, his name was already a curse, whispered sharp as barbed wire. The posse led his scattered gun hands east under guard, their horses plodding slow through the red dirt. Dust Creek did not mourn, but neither did it forget. Days later, the barn doors swung wide to laughter. Children filed inside with slates under their arms, faces scrubbed, hair slicked down with water from the well Reeves once coveted. Ella stood at the front, skirts brushed clean, though her hands still bore the rough of hammer and nail. Above her hung a new sign, carved plain, Rebecca's Schoolhouse. The letters caught the light like they belonged there all along. Bo leaned on his cane at the doorway, hat brim shading his eyes. His side still ached where the bullet had torn, but his stance held steady. Sarah hovered near, arms folded, watching the herd drift easy in the pasture beyond. The air smelled of hay and new sawdust, but beneath it lingered the faint scorch of past fires. Some scars the wind could not carry away. That night, under a sky black with stars, the Callahan barn filled again, this time with friends, neighbors, the sheriff himself. No preacher's sermon, just vows spoken plain in front of a lantern hung high. Ella and Bo stood hand in hand, silence their witness. When the words were done, Sarah set a fiddle to her shoulder, drawing out a tune rough as the land, and the barn echoed with slow dancing feet. Later, after the crowd thinned, Ella stepped outside. The desert night stretched wide, cool wind brushing her face, coyotes calling faint from the ridge. She thought of the storm, the fire, the false letters burned to ash. The questions still lingered: the anchor seal, the handwriting too careful, the reach of men who profit by shadows. Reeves was gone, but his kind was not. Bo came beside her, arms slipping quiet around her shoulders. She leaned into him, breathing in the scent of leather and smoke. The ranch was theirs now, but it was not safety that bound them. It was the choice to stay, to claim family from the ruins. Behind them, the barn glowed warm, laughter still spilling through the cracks in its boards. Ella raised her eyes to the stars, their cold fire burning steady above the desert. She knew the West gave nothing without demand, yet for the first time, she felt its silence not as threat, but as promise. Still, somewhere beyond the ridge, the wind carried a low whistle, like a reminder that land and love alike must always be defended.